Thank you for attending Implementing Issue 2, Ohio Dives into Adult Use Marijuana. The event is hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Before we begin, we have a few notes that we'd like to share with you. First, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. The chat is disabled, but you may submit questions at any time. Please note, however, that there is limited time available for Q&A during the webinar. Second, automatic closed captioning has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the transcription or to hide it, click Show Caption in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel as soon as possible following the event. A link will be shared with all registrants via email as soon as it is available. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. Doug?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks to everybody at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center for helping us coordinate this webinar. Incredibly excited to have a chance to speak with three really informed panelists to provide an set of insights and perspectives on how Issue 2, which was the ballot initiative that was passed by voters here in Ohio by a 57% positive vote to legalize recreational use, adult use cannabis in the state, how that's going, how it's being implemented. It seems like a long time ago, but it really wasn't that long ago, just 8 months ago, when the voters put the implementation on the front burner with passage. And we've had months of rulemaking. There's been lots of folks, probably particularly some here listening in on how the Department of Cannabis Control within the Department of Commerce Division of Cannabis Control has been putting together the rules. We're now at the state where we have a number of provisional licenses for adult use industry players to move forward, but they're just provisional. We're still waiting for the official start of sales in the state, but every indication suggests they're very close. And so it seemed like to us at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, where we've been tracking the law and developments in this area very closely, to talk to some thoughtful folks with different perspectives, both on how we got here and where we may be going. And so I'm going to very briefly introduce our three panelists. They can hopefully turn on their camera for a moment, and then have each of them give kind of a, not quite opening statement, but a little discussion of their perspectives, and then we're going to get into questions. And before I do the introductions, I want to remind everybody, as Holly mentioned, you can use the Q&A to bring up some questions. I'll try my best as a moderator to kind of channel some of those and direct to the panelists some of the questions that come in that way. I've got a list of about a dozen questions already as well, so there's lots to cover. I'm sure we can't cover it all, but I'm incredibly grateful for our panelists. And so let me get to them. I'll introduce them very briefly. They can say more about their background and focus in this space. First, we have Thomas Haren. He's a partner and the Cannabis Practice Chair at Frantz Ward. I also believe your official title was spokesperson for Issue 2. Among other things, you can tell me whether we still call it Issue 2 now that we're kind of at this stage, but he's going to talk about some of his experiences and vision of how this is moving forward. Then we're going to turn to Megan Henry. She's a reporter for the Ohio Capital Journal, has been doing terrific work, kind of following and tracking how implementation is going, and excited to hear her take on where we are and where we may be headed in the state. And then last but certainly not least, Shaleen, who is a distinguished cannabis policy practitioner in residence for us here at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University. She's also the founder and director of the Parabola Center for Law and Policy that works in this space. And so she's going to help give us something of a national perspective as well on where Ohio sort of fits into the broader landscape of cannabis reform that is ever dynamic. And so with that, Tom, I'll start with you, and, you helped get Issue 2 passed by the voters. How are you assessing where we are, how we got here, and where we're headed now, 8 months after the vote?
So first, let me just say thank you, Professor Berman, and to the Drug Enforcement Policy Center for having me here today and for putting on this webinar. I'm very encouraged by where we are at in the process right now. If you had asked me 12 months ago, and I think people were asking me 12 months ago, and what I said is we should expect to have first sales in October, November, December of 2024. So we are several months ahead of schedule. I know everybody always wants things to happen faster than they're happening, but I think people need to appreciate all of the hard work that the Division of Cannabis Control has been engaging in for the last several months. I mean, they're working tirelessly to implement the initiated statute. We're months ahead of schedule. We have licenses rolling out for dual use licensure at existing locations. Right now, you can track the issuance of the new dispensary licenses and the new sites that are being approved in real time by the Division of Cannabis Control. I didn't think that would happen at the earliest until September 7th, under the initiated statute. So I'm very happy with where we're at in the process. I think we're ahead of schedule. The division has been really thoughtful about consumer safety, both from a timing perspective, right? It's a matter of consumer safety to provide access to consumers so they don't have to go to the illicit market or they don't have to go to the gas stations to buy products. But they're also focused on consumer safety from an overall operational and security and process regulation standpoint as well. You know, these licenses that will be opening up here in a matter of weeks will operate under the existing medical marijuana regulatory framework. So we will have, you know, we are only weeks away from having tested, taxed, and regulated adult use products here in Ohio.
And I'll do one follow-up before, you know, turning to Megan. And this may be a little bit too flattering, or at least frames my own understanding, especially because I had the good fortune to have you come and speak to some of my classes in the past about your work kind of on the campaign and in this space. And you never struck me as a big government guy. And yet here you are saying how all these regulations are going great and we should all be sort of excited about how this is all working out. Now, part of that, I assume, is a function of the fact that the model that you helped speak for and that the voters passed sort of stays in place, that there haven't been, though there have been many proposals to change the regulatory structure. Is it that, wow, it worked out that the regulatory structure that was in the initiative just was so pitch perfect that it's all worked out terrifically? Is it just that there's been buy-in by the regulators here in Ohio? I think certainly I get that sense that unlike in some other states where a voter initiative then meets some resistance internally from the rulemakers, that there's been much more of a, I don't know if it's a collaboration or just a sense of we should move this forward as quickly as we can. But just, you know, speak a little bit to, you know, why you think this is going so well and if that's as likely to continue once we get past the sort of preparation stage and into the actual sales and industry development.
Yeah, believe me, nobody's more surprised than I am that I'm saying nice things about regulators. You know, I kind of cut my teeth, not just criticizing them, but suing them all the time. And but one of the best parts about the initiated statute is that we built on an existing regulatory framework, right? We had regulators who knew how to issue licenses, who knew how to roll out programs, who knew how to craft these regulations based on operations that we've had here for the last 6 or 7 years. So that certainly helps with a quick rollout to the program. But also, like, the staff at the division, from the leadership on down, from Superintendent Canepa all the way down, the legal team, the licensing team, the regulatory, the inspectors, we really have had buy-in from a standpoint of getting licenses up and running, being thoughtful about the process that this has rolled out. You know, I talk to folks at the division just about every day. They are working their tails off to implement this program. And so much of it is behind the scenes that, like, whenever I see reports about why is it taking so long, like, even I cringe because I know what is on their plate and how much they are doing and how quickly and tirelessly they are working. So I think the answer to your question, Professor, is it's sort of all of the above. I think that the structure of the initiated statute helped with this quick rollout. But again, from the superintendent on down, everybody at the division has been really working hard, you know, since December or January.
Thank you so much. Well, Megan, not all sunshine and roses, but my sense is, you know, a positive perspective on things as they've been developing. And I know you've been reporting effectively, you know, on a variety of issues in this space. Is that everybody's perspective? Boy, this is just going great. Or do you see some other kind of views about, you know, what's working well, what's not working well, what folks are concerned about, both, you know, kind of at the industry level and the, you know, the regulated players, but also, you know, maybe would-be consumers or, folks in the medical industry already, and medical patients. Love to hear your perspective on kind of where we are and where you think we're headed.
Yes. Yes. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me on the panel. Looking forward to a good conversation this afternoon. And yes, definitely, as Tom was saying, ahead of schedule. When the issue 2 passed last November, yes, we were hearing reports that it would be well into 2024 until sales would take place. So it does seem to be ahead of schedule. Now, earlier this year, we were reporting that sales might happen in June. June is come and gone. Yet to have that first sale of adult use. So that's still the $1 million question of when the sales will start, although we are getting very close, it seems. There was a push back in December, which I'm sure we'll get into more throughout this discussion, with lawmakers trying to tweak what was passed to try to expedite the start of sales and have them begin sooner rather than later. But that would have changed some of how the tax rates and the home grow and the THC levels would all be affected. That was basically, it's gridlocked in the state house, and it doesn't seem like that is moving anywhere at this point. So there have been some attempts to try to quicken the sales. Yes, consumers very excited. There's been quite an appetite for the adult sales to start. So I think that has definitely helped speed up things. And like Tom was saying, with having the medical marijuana program already in place and having dispensaries and cultivators already in Ohio also helps, I think, as well, just with getting this up to speed quicker than expected initially.
And I assume this is more of a question for the regulators than it is for you, Megan, but I'm wondering if you're finding anything out at this point while we're at this stage. Is there an effort, as maybe some of the slowdown, a hope that the statewide sales could happen, sort of at the same time, so that instead of it being a handful of dispensaries that are up and running, and Tom, you may know something about this as well, and a concern that lots of people would flock to, a handful of the dispensaries that are the first ones to get their official certificates of operation. Instead, they're sort of doing groundwork now to make it possible that there'll be, a wider set of stores that are open and that there's enough product. I know some other states, maybe Shaleen, you'll talk to this, some other states have had shortages early on. And so is it your sense that part of what's hopefully going on for the better is an effort to continue a smooth rollout?
Yes, my sense is, when talking to the Division of Cannabis Control so far, is they have said that there's not going to be necessarily like one day where a bunch of stores or all the stores are going to open at once for the adult use sales. It's going to be some kind of here and there. I'm not sure how many it will be at a time. It could be a handful, could just be 1 or 2. So it's kind of a wait and see, but it sounds like there won't be, so far what I'm hearing at least, and that could change, of course, is it'll just kind of happen gradually as the certificates of operation are rolled out, which could lead to a shortage potentially, like you were mentioning. So it's kind of also something we'll just kind of wait and see with that, but more to report on.
Absolutely. And Shaleen, I'm going to turn to you now, because you had experience as a regulator in Massachusetts as that state was sort of seeking to get these dynamics in line effectively. And I won't make you speak to what went well or what went poorly in Massachusetts, but very eager to get your, kind of view of, what do you think Ohio is doing well? What's your sense? It does seem like from a national perspective, it's a fairly quick timeline, but is that kind of the wrong way to look at it now, because we have such a mature kind of universe of experiences that it shouldn't be surprising that Commerce and other regulators could kind of get their act together somewhat faster, because they're not inventing the wheel or even needing to reinvent the wheel, both because in Ohio we were building off the medical program, but also because so many other states have sort of navigated this space.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I always appreciate how credible and interesting and thoughtful everyone that the DEPC includes is. And when there's something big that happens like rescheduling, like the 2 sources I look at are Congressional Research Service and DEPC. So I'll be back here in 2 weeks watching. So I want to echo the, I guess, encouragement not to focus so strongly on when sales will start. I know that is natural. I know when I was a regulator, that's all anybody wanted to talk about. But it's harmful, actually. I will say in 2021, after my term ended, I wrote a paper on social equity with the DEPC. And one of the first things I said was the unreasonableness of the timelines that we put on regulators gets translated into shortcuts. And those shortcuts tend to favor the better resourced operators and set back social equity efforts. After that, there was a report that came out that I often cite that Virginia did. There was a group of Black activists in Virginia that pushed their government to put together a report to look at how long would it actually take to set up a fair and equitable market. And so, to their credit, they partnered with the Rand Corporation, did an excellent report. And that report suggested that if Virginia wanted to set up a fair market, it should license gradually over 3 to 5 years. And to be very clear, they did not mean medical operators immediately and social equity in 5 years. They were pointing out that that's how long it takes to set up an equitable market. And I think anyone who's been a regulator would agree with that. And so, especially a few years out and having watched this process roll out in so many other states, it's just becoming clearer and clearer. It's like 100 years were spent under prohibition, and now we're making decisions that another 100 years will have a gigantic impact on consumers, safety, workers, and equity. And so the thing to be focusing on is in between. Is it 1 year? Is it 8 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? It's perverse to be focusing on that and not the long-term impacts. And so I think that if we can focus, this is what we tell. So I run Parabola Center, as Doug mentioned. This is a group of women of color attorneys who have been through this process and are trying to advise people to get involved primarily in the federal legalization discussion, but also in newer states. And the first piece of advice we give them is, please do not let medical operators start first, even though that is how you are very likely being pressured to do, because you're going to end up with a first mover advantage that hurts equity that you may never be able to make up. And I experienced that in Massachusetts. Many other states have experienced it. And sure enough, my understanding is, even though we're trying to address it in some ways, that's what we're doing in Ohio as well. So we're kind of starting from behind already. That's my biggest criticism. But I think now, if we could at least take the pressure off the timeline, that's probably the best way. And I'll join Tom's cringe prevention efforts by saying, when you talk about this program, don't ask when do sales start, ask more substantive questions about consumer safety and the market structure that's being set up for the long term.
Those are such great themes, Shaleen, and I want to, in fact, I'm going to make sure we spend a good bit of time talking on social equity more generally, because I suspect Tom, who was involved in moving issue 2 forward, is interested in addressing the social equity and jobs piece of the initiative that voters passed that seemed to be an important part and that doesn't seem to have kind of gotten out of the starting gates yet. And before we get to that, though, and it's really because, even as somebody who follows this field, I sometimes struggle to figure out, well, what are they doing there in commerce? Like, what takes so long? Why is this so complicated? Why is this so hard? And I guess I'll start with you, Tom, and then I'll come back to Shaleen and Megan. If you want to jump in, please do. Like, can you just even talk about some of the intricacies of the rules? And, to the extent you might want to speak to Shaleen's concern that prioritizing the medical providers, already start shaping the industry in certain ways, and that we're likely to see that, whatever follow-up we might see. But I also assume it was partially a function of the fact that those folks have dealt with a lot of these rules and these intricacies. And I think you may better than I could even prime it to say, what are some of the little nuts and bolts, whether it's for the consumer benefit, whether it's for workers' benefits, whether it's for the industry as a whole, that it's so important, as Shaleen's emphasizing, that we focus on like making sure the regulatory space in the industry is moving forward in a positive way, rather than worrying so much about, do sales start on August 1st or September 1st or even, October or November 1st?
Yeah, so I'll give 2 sort of concrete examples of sort of behind the scenes or tricky things that, it seems to me the division has had to deal with over the last couple of months. When you are licensing an existing dispensary to sell for both medical and adult use purposes, here in Ohio, we have, since the inception of the program, had a seed to sale inventory tracking system set up the state has contracted with a third-party service provider known as Metric to help track all of those sales from the time a plant is grown at a cultivator and it's either 12 inches in height or the stem splits. It gets tagged with an RFID tag, and that plant is tracked through the entire cultivation process to being a processed product ultimately sold at a dispensary. In addition to that, every medical sale is also tracked through the prescription monitoring system. And so the state had to invest significant resources making sure that Metric worked with the prescription monitoring system, which also worked with the operator's internal inventory tracking program. Well, now you're going to have a situation where that dispensary is selling the same products to a medical consumer and to an adult use consumer. And so you have to make sure that Metric works and the inventory tracking system works to track those sales independent of who they're sold to. That's a lot of back-end stuff that you have to navigate. And that takes time because you've got, hundreds of licensees with their own different point of sale systems, with their own processes. And so even that can be a big problem that the division has had to work through. And the second example I'll give, which I know the DEPC has spent a lot of time talking about, are local moratoriums. There's a process under Revised Code Chapter 3780, the adult use section of the code enacted as part of Issue 2, that lays out a process if a locality wants to enact a moratorium when they have existing dispensaries. Well, when you're issuing all of these licenses, those moratoriums impact how those licensees can operate, how they can operate, whether the municipality will acknowledge or agree with what the statute says or how it should be interpreted. So there really are just logistical issues that operators and the regulators have to deal with. There's a different process that's under Chapter 3780 of the Revised Code that deals with employee licensing, because in the medical program, every employee has to get background checked and separately badged by the division. So there's a different process in the adult use market. Again, if you're working at the same facility, how do you merge those two licensing frameworks? At the same time, when the Department of Commerce was also taking over regulatory authority from the Board of Pharmacy over dispensaries. And the Board of Pharmacy had its own employee licensing framework. So there have been a lot of hurdles that the division has had to overcome, and they have overcome them over the last 6 or 7 months that, to your point, Professor, like the general public doesn't see because they're not in the nitty-gritty of the licensing process.
That was all very, very helpful, and and thank you for the plug for the work we've done at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, just trying to track which localities have imposed moratoria. And Megan, maybe you want to speak if you've done any reporting on that or have a sense of how that's unfolded. But Tom, just clarify my understanding: even if a locality imposes a moratorium, the existing businesses can stay operational. It's just they can't expand and take advantage of other opportunities that Issue 2 provided for a recreational use approach, whereas in other places where there weren't existing businesses, a moratorium may mean something else. And so even in the space of a local moratorium, what's been going on there in the past, and then of course presumably these localities can change the rules midstream or after the fact. And so I myself have occasionally sat down and tried to map this out literally and figuratively, and it's just it gets very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, so the process that's contemplated under Chapter 3780 of the Revised Code, and I won't get too far into the weeds, it effectively says if you're an existing dispensary and the locality wants to impose a moratorium on adult use sales, you have the opportunity to put that issue before voters. And during the pendency of that referendum process, you do get to open to service the adult use market. Some localities have pushed back on that. And so there are a lot of disputes and pockets throughout the state about what exactly the statute means, how exactly does it work. But certainly the intent was voters voted for adult use sales, and the voters, we think should get what they voted for. And there's a process laid out under Chapter 3780 where if you're an existing dispensary, even if that locality imposed a moratorium back in February, you still are able to open. And if they pass it again after you get licensed, then you have an opportunity to put the issue before voters.
Thank you, Tom and Megan. I don't know if you've been covering, this issue closely. Again, we've been lucky to have researchers at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center tracking, and you can find on our website our latest report of just what localities have imposed some form of moratoria. But does that add to the complication, Megan, of even sort of following what's happening out there and the ability to sort of, tell people and tell readers about, just what they can expect in their town, in their county, and throughout the state going forward?
Yeah, definitely. I think that can play a role in it. I mean, it's such a fluid thing, and it's confusing. It's not super straightforward, as Tom explained. So I think that can cause some confusion with citizens as to what exactly is allowed in my community, in my municipality. So it looks like there are nearly 60 across the state. And really kind of all over the map of Ohio, it looks like. But yeah, I think just some of the because there are so many layers to it and hoops to kind of jump through, I think that kind of can add to some of the confusion for just regular Ohioans.
Absolutely. And so, Shaleen, I'm going to turn to you, especially because I'm going to start leading us into the social equity story. Is there I don't want to quite say a silver lining, because every locality has to figure out what it cares about, but if moratoria are, slowing the process down, making this be a kind of more deliberative, and maybe there's a locality that's eager to, see, what the rules are going to be for the state, how other regions are going to end up implementing and what the market looks like. Does that give a locality even more kind of opportunity to do equity if that's what they're committed to? Again, I don't get a sense based on the pattern of the local moratoria that they're driven by equity concerns, but is there at least a sense, or has your experience working in Massachusetts or elsewhere, that having more local control can be a good end towards moving the industry in the directions that you think are important? Or is this necessarily, going to have to be a statewide story? And then we'll get back to Tom to talk about what he thought the statewide story was supposed to be with issue 2 for the Social Equity and Jobs Fund. But just kind of your take on local control and where it fits into some of these broader issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the question of whether it's a good thing will depend on what the municipalities in Ohio want to do and whether that time is used effectively. I think that I've spoken about this, that I thought the biggest mistake in Massachusetts after letting the medical operators go first was that local control, there's too much of it because they had to essentially get licensed at both the local and state level, but also just that the localities didn't have enough guidance from the state or from the statute. And so they ended up, given that, we have city councilors who just don't have time. They're not thinking about this 24 hours a day like the rest of us are. They have to kind of listen to whoever's coming, giving them ordinances, giving them language, and then giving them PowerPoints of like fancy facilities they might have in other states. And so that's how you end up with cities that license larger operators, and they don't have the resources to give the smaller operators what they need to succeed. So what I would suggest is if there is some time that's being built in now because of local moratoriums or other reasons, that the state puts together guidance. And really a model ordinance would be ideal. It took us 5 years in Massachusetts, but we finally passed a law that requires municipalities to be equitable in the same way that the state is required to, and then require the agency to give them a model ordinance. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, to review the agreements between the business and the locality, because before we were seeing a lot of bribery hidden in those contracts.
Yeah, we could do an whole other hour on the challenge the local officials face and the way in which those challenges map out into sometimes less than ideal behavior. I'll put it that way. But that maybe is actually a very good segue to give Tom a chance to talk about both his understanding of the provisions of issue 2 that were about the Social Equity and Jobs Fund and the way he thought that was going to operate. And I've certainly gotten a sense, and there's some questions in the Q&A that kind of, that seems to be a piece that hasn't been addressed, or at least isn't as fundamental to what's been going on to date. Love to have you just sort of talk about your own expectations with the language that's currently in the statute. And then also to kind of follow up, I think Shaleen's terrific insight, which is, would one of the ways for whoever's focused on equity issues under the statutory language to really be working with localities to try to make sure that that's kind of a focal point for these energies. Again, I know there's other mandates that are in the statute itself. So if you could just sort of speak in general to what you thought issue 2 required or requires going forward, where you think we are with that, and then also, how much maybe opportunity there is for creativity as we, move forward and see Ohio's industry and landscape advance.
So the two largest pieces that touch on social equity under the initiated statute, the first is obviously the funding of the Social Equity and Jobs Program Fund, right? 36% of all revenue generated by the 10% tax at the point of sale on adult use products goes into this new social equity fund, which by statute is to be used on a number of equitable causes, some of which are aimed towards participation and representation in the industry to make sure that social equity applicants, are able to participate, and that fees and those sorts of things and the financial aspect are not barriers to participation in the industry, but also, direct investment in areas of the state that have been hit disproportionately hard by marijuana prohibition, funding and studying criminal justice reform, bail reform, those sorts of restorative efforts. The second piece is on, again, more this representation perspective, in that the Department of Development under the statute is charged with creating this social equity and jobs program to certify participants such that the state will be in a position to issue 50 new dispensary licenses and 40 new cultivation licenses with a preference towards social equity program participants. And so where we're at from a process standpoint is we are waiting on the Department of Development to establish that program. The Division of Cannabis Control obviously can't issue licenses with a preference to participants in a program that has not been created yet.
And so at the risk of trying to figure out what may be hard to figure out, why hasn't that program been created? What is it? Is it your sense that until we saw sales start and the market move forward, the Department of Development was disinclined to start producing it? Was it the fact that there was pretty significant debate about either eliminating or changing the terms of the social equity piece of the initiative in the General Assembly? Is it sort of all of the above? It's a busy summer, do tell. Is there inadequate staffing? I've heard you talk about, how challenging the Department of Commerce has things in the Division of Cannabis Control because they just don't have unlimited staff and they have a lot to do. What piece of it explains why we're not getting, it seems now, 8 months on, any movement on that front?
I don't have a good answer to that question, Professor. I don't know. I have not interacted with the Department of Development on this topic in particular. We've been really focused on the rollout of the rules and the licensure process, from a more general standpoint. So I think I'd have to defer that question to the Department of Development.
Megan, do you have any insight, or is this the interesting missing piece that just everyone's been distracted, understandably so, with what Commerce is up to, and so this component of reform and development has just not been done by the Department of Development?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I definitely just seen a lot less chatter and a lot less tension, at least in the media standpoint. When it comes to the social equity piece, a lot of it has been focused on, what's happening when it comes to sales and the steps that that people are going through to get to that point where we can have our first sale. So that has kind of been like a missing piece, I would say, in the conversation. I think too, we're probably gonna talk about this a little later, maybe in our conversation, but I think expungement is a huge part of it as well. And social equity was definitely talked about with lawmakers when they were trying to tweak this to expedite sales. So I definitely think that although it hasn't got as much attention as when the sales are going to start, I think it is an important piece that will be looked at more and more once sales have started and are rolled out.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Megan, because yeah, that's been my sense, and we've seen this both in the debate right after the initiative passed, and then in continuing debate about possible reform by the General Assembly. It seems like there's pretty bipartisan interest in creating an expungement or some other additional resources that's focused on record relief, which is great, but sometimes that's been coupled with an effort to limit or change, the revenue stream or other components of a broader social equity effort. And so I think that's one of the challenges, particularly for advocates for social equity, in sort of both understanding the legal and political lay of the land, kind of at this particular moment. And we'll definitely get to in a few minutes kind of what we can expect the General Assembly to jump in on in the future. But Shaleen, again, I'm inclined to turn to you as the expert, not just on social equity, but on kind of feeling these politics out well. Is it sensible for advocates, concerned about the broad range of equity issues to say, let's start, sending letters to the Department of Development and say, get with it, come on, move faster, because, darn it, this is getting left behind? Or is there a sense that, if it really is a 3 to 5 year, runway needed to do equity really effectively, that maybe a focus on, getting the legislature to do expungement or other components of maybe community investment, as opposed to really focusing on, the industry itself for social equity. Your thoughts on kind of, what particularly Ohioans who I know care about these issues, but may be uncertain in a dynamic and somewhat opaque world, where they should focus their time and energy to make sure those interests are considered.
Yeah, that's an important and practical question. And I would suggest, yes, I think you should absolutely make a fuss and call the department, make a public fuss, and point out that, if this is the reason or a big part of the reason why this law passed in the first place, we can't abandon it, in favor of sales once it has passed. And I think it's worth explicitly recognizing that there are financial reasons why there is such a fuss about why wind sales are going to start. Like, obviously customers want that, but also there is a strong incentive for companies that have put a lot of money into this effort. They need their doors to open, they need the revenue to come in, they're worried about their stock price. And so that's real, but that's also separated from what the people of Ohio are likely most interested in. And according to our research, Americans are most worried about ending arrests, and in social equity defined as repairing the harms. And so I do think it's important that they make that clear to the department. There's some good reasons why probably it's taking a while. And of course, I haven't been in touch with them either, but my guess would be collecting the data. Is if anybody has tried to get criminal justice data, or arrest data, how tough that is from different localities. And so if they're trying to identify different communities that have been harmed, that can take years. There's always missing pieces. And then also there's a lot more data now about what's working in other states than there was 5 years ago. And I think it's a great thing, but it's also probably confusing to regulators, not just in terms of social equity and expungement, but also, testing standards, potency. Now, instead of copying and pasting what other states are doing, you have a lot to evaluate. That's going to take longer. But all of that said, expungement does not take the time that licensing takes. And so if everybody can band together and say, let's work on expungement as our first priority right now, I think that's going to be great for everyone.
You mentioned something, Shaleen, I want to follow up briefly, partially because I think I saw an email today or something, a new report out of Illinois, where Illinois was sort of bragging that they've got the most socially equitable industry in the country. Are there particular states in your work that you think about that, again, whether it's specifically for the Ohio regulators or for advocates who want to say, to the Department of Development or whatever else, these are the states to look to, these are the programs that have been most efficacious? Maybe it's also in working with localities. Is there a convenient, I know we've sort of tried to do this with the center to some degree, of sort of best practices, or at least the right places to look for as an industry matures and develops in a state, which states have been doing, better jobs on some of these issues?
I think that I have to read what Illinois just put out, but I think there's only one state right now that has worked with licensing and market structure effectively, and that's New York. 125 out of 133 of their currently operating licensees are people who have been harmed by the war on drugs. And that's just a complete 180 from every other state that's been struggling. And I actually think that's related to a lot of the pushback that they're getting, frankly. But then who's done well on expungement is an entirely different question. And I know you're an expert on that. That might be worth you mentioning as well.
I appreciate that, Shaleen. And you mentioned it very briefly, but I think it's such an interesting, and to some sense, depressing reality that, oh, here's the state that's done great on social equity, and that's the state that's often used by industry players and others as, look how terrible they've done on licensing, and, aren't they awful, and what takes them so long, and why is this so hard? And so that's where I think even as you get political buy-in to doing equitable work, that doesn't make the tension go away in terms of the relationship between some industry players and regulators and the broader community. I think it's an ongoing challenge, and that's why it's such an important issue to continue focusing on. And so I think we've got our not quite marching orders, but essentially we've got to make sure these issues remain front and center, especially in light of the requirements of the statute. One question that came in, I think is an important one and valuable to talk to, and eager to get everybody's sort of take on the medical industry, right? In many respects, we've talked a little bit already about how the adult use industry in Ohio is going to be starting with only dual use dispensaries and really built upon the regulatory structure there. But my sense is nationwide, my sense is there's an expectation to some degree here in Ohio that once the adult use market gets going, the medical market, if not disappearing, would decline significantly. And there are obviously a set of industry players who would be just fine with that. There may be a set of consumers who are just fine with that. I know, among other things, the cost of getting a medical recommendation, or I guess being registered in the state, went down to a cent in a recognition that in an adult use world, the medical regulations and rules and fees look a lot different. And so just would like kind of a quick take on what folks are expecting with the medical market, and whether that's something that should be of concern for sort of advocates and researchers, or it's just, the market's going to do what the market's going to do, and no matter how hard we try, the folks are going to gravitate towards whatever part of the market makes sense to them. Tom, I'll start with you on that.
So the way that the division is regulating the adult use marijuana program, as you mentioned, Professor, we're starting with dual use dispensaries. I'd hazard a guess to say that every single dispensary that will come online over the course of the next year will be a dual use dispensary, meaning they're going to serve both adult use and medical patients. To be a dual use dispensary, you have to agree to stay a dual use dispensary for several years. And that comes with some requirements, right? You have to silo a certain amount of inventory to ensure that you can meet anticipated demand for medical patients, and put other processes in place to ensure that medical patients continue to have access to medical marijuana products. And that was done so that we don't see medical patients get left behind. So I think what you'll see from the industry standpoint is the ability to service whatever the demand is ultimately for medical patients here in Ohio. If medical patients make the decision that they would prefer to not be a medical patient, they'll just buy adult use marijuana products. The industry will be able to adapt. But if patients say, no, you know what, I do want to be able to still talk to my doctor. Maybe I have some employment protections with my employer if I maintain my my patient card. So I want to keep that recommendation. Then I think you'll see the industry respond and still continue to be able to serve the existing medical industry. I'm sorry, to be able to serve existing medical patients. And the move to Schedule 3, or potential move to Schedule 3, makes that question all the more interesting, which I know we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to get to rescheduling writ large, but I do think that's one of the ones that's necessarily a part of any conversation of predicting where the medical industry in Ohio or anywhere else may be headed. Megan, do you have a sense? I don't know if you followed kind of the medical story. We've at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center has done a annual patient survey, and we're asking a few questions about how patients or would-be patients are reacting to the coming availability of adult use, and so we'll be interested in reporting on that in the months ahead. But it's certainly something that has changed the dynamic of both access and market use in other states. Do you have a feel, Megan, about what folks are saying out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was a reporter previously at the Columbus Dispatch when medical marijuana sales first began in Ohio. And so I covered that back when that happened. And so now it's interesting to be reporting on the adult sales when that will start for the Ohio Capital Journal. But I think people like options. And so I think to Tom's point, I think some people who currently are on medical use marijuana will just use adult use. But some people will want to have the option and continue to use medical. So I think people will like having kind of the option. And like Tom was saying, since a dual use facilities will have to still provide medical, some people might just want to keep the status quo. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I do think there will be some folks that will just say, oh, it'll be easier to just do adult use than to get a recommendation from my doctor. So people might go that route, but we'll have to see what the data shows and what consumers choose to do ultimately.
I saw you nodding your head, Shaleen. I don't know if you had a take on this. I'm sure you worked through this in Massachusetts, other places as well.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that has actually changed significantly because it wasn't an issue for me 5 years ago. Our medical program was fine then, but now the numbers of patients has dropped dramatically. And I would say in my conversations with regulators, this is probably their number 2 concern after intoxicating hemp, because I think people are really worried about what's going to happen to their state program. And at the risk of repeating myself, this is something where it just can't be driven by industry, because I think if our values are that patients should have access, and that even patients who can't afford it should have access, and that patients should have access to strains that are maybe not the most profitable, then that is very different, from what the market is going to choose. And so I think we have to look at what our patients need and maybe make some changes to save these programs from disappearing.
Yeah, and I'll chime in as the kind of lawyer law professor for at least a minute. And I think a huge part of this, both in Ohio and nationwide, is going to be whether over time there are more legal protections for medical users that are distinct from, we know that sometimes the tax reality is different, and that's going to be true here in Ohio as well. But I think, and you mentioned this a little bit, Tom, whether it's I've got more employee protections as a medical user than I might as an adult user, maybe these are issues that get to childcare or other things as well, where, status as a medical user just in law formally is different. And again, this is where you mentioned briefly, and we're not going to do it all today. We're doing another panel for the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center in a couple of weeks, focusing on rescheduling at the federal level. But definitely my expectation is if rescheduling goes through, and so at the federal level, we have Schedule 3, which means there's legal medical uses that can very much change the legal landscape, so that there will be more folks who are using medically being able to make claims. Maybe it's under variety of disability laws or in other ways to protect rights, but rights that will only be protected if you're a medical user and not just for recreational use. And I think those are topics to keep an eye on, and we'll certainly be keeping an eye on it at the center. All right, I want to shift to kind of what's in the not too distant future, because I think there are some clear possibilities once we get past this November election. My understanding, Megan, you may know better than I do, there actually are no legislative sessions scheduled here in Ohio until we get through the election. And so there's not going to be any more talk, or at least, action on possible legislative reforms to the initiative until we get to what's often called the lame duck period. But my instinct is that will be a period where there'll be this talk again. And assuming we have sales that have started and we're starting to watch the industry unfold a little bit, that may be even more of a fuel, especially if, and Tom, you mentioned this and I want to emphasize it, the money starts coming in terms of resources, from the special tax and other economic development that comes with it. The legislative reform could take all sorts of forms. Maybe there are folks who want to restrict the program more, but it may be, I think, more likely that it becomes much more real. They are much more eager at that point to redirect the tax resources relative to what the initiative put in place. And so I'm curious, especially for our local folks, whether they're looking to that lame duck period as a time when we might see some reform, particularly focused on tax revenue. And that might also be the time at which getting expungement or some other social equity as part of that is going to be a possibility. Are you hearing anything along those lines, Megan? Are you nervous, Tom, that at some point they're going to mess with this formula that's in place? Ed, Megan.
So yes, the lawmakers are not expected to come back until after the November election, like you mentioned, and so it's highly unlikely that between now and then that any action would be taken from the legislator standpoint when it comes to marijuana. But yes, we will be entering lame duck, which is the time right before the end of the current General Assembly, and then in January, a new General Assembly will start. General Assemblies go on for 2 years, and so any bill, no matter how close it was to passing, if it does not ultimately pass by the end of General Assembly during that lame duck period, would have to be reintroduced and start all over again for the next General Assembly, which is why there is such a rush during lame duck to pass bills, especially bills that are close to passing. And so yes, I do think that the tax revenue, the THC levels, home grow will all be things that could potentially be woven into bills and passed. Advertisement for marijuana has also been a hotly debated topic that's come up quite a bit. Lawmakers have also hit up on where marijuana can be smoked. And making sure that children aren't, walking in a park and smelling marijuana or seeing marijuana advertisements. So those have been some hot button issues for lawmakers that Republicans have brought up. So there has been definitely there's tensions in the House and the Senate, which for reasons that I don't have time to get into. That are at play here that have caused some bills to pass in the Senate, but maybe not really see much action over in the House, and vice versa with the House and the Senate. So that could also just come into play, some politics that aren't even related to marijuana as much. But yeah, definitely could be some changes, potential, or some changes that we might see during lame duck. But also too, next summer will be the budget cycle. And that sometimes is where we see legislation pass through the budget that might otherwise taken a longer time to pass through as a bill.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and they emphasize the budget point, because I've certainly been talking about and thinking about, and I'll turn to you in a minute, Tom, the reality that it seems like there's two windows. There's that lame duck window, which will be the outgoing legislature and things that they want to get done, and there's always a lot of legislative activity, as you mentioned, and this, I think, would be among the things kind of on their plate to at least seriously consider. And then there's the budget bill, which doesn't become official, if I've got this right, until the end of June, but that it's very common because it has to get passed, that there'll be things included in there, and that further, modification or changes joined into the budget bill could certainly happen. And it certainly would make sense, especially if we're talking about tax allocation, to think that that's a setting when they're thinking about dollars and cents, that they might be thinking about changing some of the allocations that issue 2 put forward. I'm wondering if you want to speak to, in this context, particularly the intoxicating hemp issue. Again, we could readily have 4 more seminars about just what intoxicating hemp is and how it impacts the cannabis marketplace. But I know Governor DeWine and some of his folks have been particularly vocal on saying that that's a key regulatory point of emphasis. And to some extent, and I'll let Tom speak to this too, that there are cannabis industry folks who like that idea. They don't like the idea that some hemp products have less regulations and can evade restrictions that traditional cannabis products have. And so would you expect that also to come up in lame duck or in the budget bill? And will this be all one gigantic bill, or does it seem more likely that there's no way they could all agree on everything, and so we'd expect more kind of partial bills to move their way through?
Yeah, definitely. Governor DeWine has definitely made calls for intoxicating hemp there to be stricter regulations and more crackdown on that. There hasn't been as much. I haven't seen as much of an appetite for that so far for state lawmakers, but there has been just so much that they've been trying to pass, and so I definitely think that could come up during lame duck. I don't know. I don't know if it would come up, and they could try to put it in all in one bill and make it into like a mega bill, so to speak. That could be a strategy. Sometimes they like to use the word, the vehicle to get this to pass. That could be the vehicle for it to pass, or they could maybe parse it out into more digestible chunks into other bills. So we'll have to see what the vehicle they choose to try to pass some of these changes.
Very good. Thank you, Megan. Tom, I assume your goal would be to have no vehicle moving along because you like where things stand, although that may not be true on the intoxicating hemp side of things, but your own take on kind of what we should expect from the General Assembly, you know, whether lame duck, whether in the budget bill discussions or even beyond, as we see all the hard work of issue 2 and all the regulatory effect kind of move forward. Maybe a better way to even ask this is, are there particular things you worry about that would be, you know, more likely to get the General Assembly to go beyond what's been kind of debate but not action, you know, into action?
Well, look, I'm an Irish Catholic lawyer. I worry about everything. It's just sort of my nature. What I will say is that by the time the legislature comes back into session, we will have a fully fleshed out regulatory program in the adult use market. So, you know, issue 2, the initiated statute, already provides for a prohibition on public consumption of marijuana products. So that's already taken care of in what the voters passed in November. The statute already provides and requires the Division of Cannabis Control to promulgate a number of different types of regulations about product advertising, testing, packaging, all of those sorts of things. So to the extent there are concerns about those issues, by the time the legislature comes back into session, they will already be addressed by the Division of Cannabis Control and will be effective law at that point. So, you know, one thing I've learned over the last year, 2 years, is that it's a fool's errand to predict what the General Assembly will do, let alone in a lame duck session. But I think the entire dynamic for the discussion about the adult use market will be dramatically different from where it's been over the last 6 or 7 months, because we will be able to point to exactly how this program is regulated, the exact way that they're treating advertising, the exact way they're protecting children with packaging and labeling requirements, et cetera.
Yeah, and one thing that one of the Q&A questions sort of got to, potency has been a point of complication. There was a lot of uncertainty about what the language in the initiative actually sort of called for. I mean, and you know, more broadly, I know the public health community is concerned about the potency of products, and I guess that's where I sort of wonder is, you know, is there an expectation that once the industry is up and going and the dispensaries are open, consumers will be able to get a wide range of potency products and get well educated about that so that they can be responsible consumers, or you know, there are these concerns that the market's inclined to only cater to high potency users and to develop products that are riskiest. And I think your point is an extraordinarily important one, which is it's much easier to regulate once you see what's going on sensibly than to anticipate all the things that can go wrong if they're not actually doing that. But potency has been something that I certainly see you know, from public health researchers and others, that there's a continued concern about and continued fear that the industry doesn't regulate itself very well in that space. And I'm wondering if you just want to speak to that briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, there is no minimum potency under the adult use program. There are some types of products that are higher potency. Those are products that tend to be purchased by people who really need high potency products, right? People who have chronic or terminal conditions where they need a high potency product. But the vast majority of products that will be sold, certainly in the consumable market, will be much lower. And to that end, the division is considering promulgating rules right now as part of their rulemaking process, where edible products will be capped at 10 milligrams of THC per serving, and I think it's 100 milligrams per package. That's similar to the rules that Michigan has in place for their market. So you know, you have to walk a line between certainly the consumer safety standpoint, which the division is you know, really doing pretty thoughtfully, but also ensuring that the industry here in Ohio can compete with our neighboring states and with the illicit market. Because remember, one of the goals of any adult use market is to bring consumers into the regulated, tested, and taxed legal market so that they're not purchasing unregulated products that still are high potency, but they're also unregulated in the illicit market.
So Shaleen, as we're starting to wrap up, and again, turning to you as sort of our national expert, are there things we've seen nationwide? There are particular problems or particular, I know there are certain aspects of the industry that you're troubled by that you wish would sometimes trigger a legislative response, or at least, get regulation to move a particular direction. Or maybe that's even a good way to pose this is, if you were advising the Ohio General Assembly, as they're now had debated but couldn't get anything done, didn't agree on a further refinement going forward, what they should be watching for, as dispensary sales start, as the industry starts to unfold, what should be the focal point. We'll get back to expungement in a minute. We'll talk a little bit more criminal justice reform, always my favorite. But as a former regulator and an advisor and advocate towards policymakers, what do you keep an eye on right now, looking forward, to the next 6 months, the next year, for sensible ways to create a program for possible reform?
Well, this past weekend, we just held the anti-monopoly crash course and leadership training in Providence. And what we were trying to do is look forward, maybe a bit more than a year, maybe 5-10 years to federal legalization, because it is coming, and it is really important that states have that in mind as they build their programs, especially related to the discussion we just had about potency. I think that in general, the industry has been pretty responsible. I think it's in their best interest to be responsible, not to cause, to at least minimize the harm that they're causing, and also to make sure that when it comes to not serving children, not getting around those rules, that they've been pretty compliant. However, we also know that the tobacco and alcohol industry has not been responsible. And once we have federal legalization, they already are planning now through front groups to come in and start acquiring companies. And so I think it's really important as we look ahead that we're looking at things like potency, but that we're also looking at regulatory capture concerns and making sure that we won't have businesses that are so big that they'll be able to immediately circumvent the programs that we have now and the guidelines and restrictions. Because I think now we're kind of relying on the industry to be responsible, but we won't be able to do that 5 or 10 years down the line as we see more consolidation.
Very good, very helpful. And now I'm going to sort of self-servingly turn to kind of, and maybe Megan, you'll enjoy this too, because I'll focus on Tom and Shaleen particularly. What are some other metrics that researchers and or reporters ought to be sort of looking at? My sense is, and this is not meant as a criticism, but the industry is very good at sort of keeping track of who's buying what product, right, and of doing things, as is true for any industry, sort of tracking their market. And how they're doing as an industry. But the broader community concerns, we've seen public health folks obviously try to study some public health impacts. That's challenging, especially in the short term, for a variety of complicated reasons. As a criminal justice researcher, I'm certainly thinking about looking at arrest rates, looking at whether we get expungements and what those look like, what kind of resources are devoted to that. But I guess I just sort of like to open it up of what are the dogs that might be barking that we're not listening for, or components of, you say, Tom, you worry about everything that's useful, but are there, parts of your worrying that you're worried people aren't paying attention to this component of the story, good or bad, things that, it's understandable that industry players, even researchers, sort of, kind of take the low hanging fruit of what's out there and what to pay attention to. One thing that I'll kind of lean into, it's something that I think we've been seeing in the academic discourse about this, is the way culture is shifting around marijuana use, and how important it is to kind of build as much healthy culture as you can, right? You can even go at the industry level, start low and, go slow, or whatever, versions of that, where there's an understanding that it's important to get beyond, what the government's doing, what the regulators are doing, what the industry is doing. It's going to be about individual behavior and about helping people be responsible users. But are there components of those stories that you think, the more you think about it and look at it, the more you realize more people need to think about and look at that part of the equation, so that us at the center, Megan in her reporting, can make sure we don't miss that part. That's a really hard and vague question, but that's why I'm asking it. Tom, what do you think?
Man, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest things to watch is access for consumers. And are we successful in transitioning folks from buying in Michigan to the legal market? Are we successful in bringing them from the illicit market into Ohio's legal regulated market? You know, the DEPC has done a tremendous job over the last several years with these patient surveys, sort of identifying why our medical program has had half of the number of patients that you would expect in a state of 11.5 million people, and identified a number of areas, right? Not enough dispensaries, products cost too much, they're too far away from each other, you know, whatever those issues are. But something that gets lost sometimes in some of those reasons, you know, the industry gets criticized. Oh, prices are too high. It's the big bad operators. But there's not always an understanding of, well, what are the costs that those operators have to incur in order to participate in this market, right? 280E, right? I can't take standard business deductions. Well, that has a real impact on prices for consumers. I have to pay $100,000 every single year just to renew my cultivator license, or I got to pay $70,000 every 2 years just to renew my dispensary license. Every advertising that has to get pre-approved is a new fee. Every employee is a new fee. We got to have storage costs for surveillance, but like all of those costs are in the background that ultimately have to get passed on to the consumer in some way, shape, or form. So the one thing that I would suggest, you know, keeping an eye on are, okay, this program's up, it's running. How can we ensure that we can, as an industry, accommodate consumers enough so that they're not still feeling like they have to go to Michigan, or they're not still feeling like they have to buy products at a gas station or in the illicit market?
Thank you. Very, very helpful. Okay, Shaleen, you've gotten a chance to think of the answer to my vague and hard question.
Well, I guess I would want to defer to the public health community, because they say a lot that our research is not keeping up with the products. And I think that is so true. Even where we do have limited data, where there have been emergency room calls, there's not good data about what products those were and where they came from. And I think in general, if we just knew more information about the products, the mode of consumption, and like you said, if we could at least just keep up with the industry, we could have better regulations. I definitely worry about advertising, especially if 280E gets reversed, which of course it should, because it's an unfair rule. Companies will be able to deduct their advertising and marketing expenses, and that could cause a lot of problems, given, you know, what products they're likely to advertise most. The other piece I'd want to emphasize is worker surveys. I don't think there's enough information about what workers are going through. And when we do have surveys, it's usually owners or consumers. And my impression of Ohio is that there's a pretty strong labor movement. So maybe this is something that Ohio would lead in. I would love to see that data. And sadly, being in Massachusetts, I was a regulator in the state where a worker died because of worker conditions. And I'm always thinking about what we might have done differently, and maybe some more data and information could have prevented it.
Thank you. And it's sad to hear that story, but yeah, we've been thinking as a center about, you know, kind of who's working at dispensaries and where does that fit into sort of a broader set of kind of economic development realities. And you know, there's some economists and some others who've been doing sort of research just about, you know, whether and how cannabis reform sort of changes the economic landscape in a variety of ways. And I think those are also really hard but really important questions that yeah, I appreciate you particularly focusing on the worker piece of it, because I think there's a lot to that as well. Megan, I don't want to give you cut you out from the opportunity to answer the hard and vague question, but maybe I'll sort of start wrapping us up by saying, like, what are you planning? And I don't know if you get to decide exactly what your pitch agenda is, but as you're looking forward to, we've already joked a little bit and half seriously, half depressingly. Well, of course, there's going to be coverage of when the stores start selling product, but I'm wondering what other stories you're planning to cover and how you look at reporting in this space in the months and years to come.
Yeah, definitely focusing initially on sales, but I think a lot of what has come up in this conversation has been enlightening, and I want to follow up on. I want to really look into the expungement and the efforts with that. Just talking to consumers, you know, both people who our medical use. Are they gonna continue down that path? Are they gonna do adults and then adult users, and just their thoughts on how the program is going, how the rollout is, how sales, their perspective on how things are going. And also I want to do look at the social equity component of issue 2 as well, once sales are being rolled out. And of course I'll be watching closely during lame duck. There's lots of things I'll be keeping an eye on, and my team as well. I'll be keeping an eye on. So lots to cover. So this is giving me some great ideas for stories to look into.
Wonderful, thank you. And I guess I teased expungement a fair amount, and it's useful to sort of circle back here as we wind up, emphasize that our center, the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, has done a lot of work on all sorts of record relief, and that includes a service project called Opportunity Port that helps people get access to legal help to seal their records under existing Ohio law. One of the interesting dynamics of that is the extent to which Ohio's got fairly robust petition-based record relief mechanisms, but we know, and this has been a universal story, not just in the cannabis space, but across the board, that's necessarily going to be limited in use because of the costs and the hassles that come up with doing a petition-based work rather than the automatic general approach. But that's also being studied. If you tell people you've gotten your record expunged or sealed, but they don't really know. And also there's a challenge with people with multiple records. Maybe they have a cannabis offense and they have a bunch of other offenses. It can sometimes be better to have a chance to do a petition-based system, be connected with legal help, and get all of that done rather than have something done automatically and then not have access to further relief. And so that's one of the challenges that we're studying and following. I will say, and this is my pitch, and again, credit to issue 2, though we'll see if the Department of Development channels those resources. Ultimately, on all those fronts, it's a resource issue. It's getting information out to people to know that they have the possibility of getting some record relief, helping them get that. And then it's also helping them utilize that effectively, helping them understand whether it's they're seeking employment, they're seeking housing, they're seeking schooling opportunities, that they have additional abilities to do that because of record relief. That's just a lot of work. It's really hard and costly. And so I'm hopeful the Department of Development, as it gets those funds in, as I expect them to be flowing, we'll be investing in that space effectively to help Ohioans. And that's where I know we'll be looking. I also want to make that pitch generally, and I'll give everybody the sort of the last word. The Drug Enforcement and Policy Center is obviously going to keep following these topics going forward, and we're always eager to hear from policymakers, to hear from advocates, to hear from interested reporters and the community at large about what topics they think merit more attention and focus. And so the kind of last pitch, I already sort of did it before, but Shaleen, Tom, Megan, a last word and or a last recommendation. What should the next panel be about? What should the next report be about? What do you think we ought to be making sure we don't leave behind in our conversations as we get on the, it seems, precipice of actual sales here in Ohio in an adult use cannabis market? Go ahead, Shaleen.
I just wanted to acknowledge the Supernova Women group that did a social equity impact report. They found that every dollar spent on social equity programs had a $1.20 return, but when it was the direct reinvestment piece, it jumped up to $4.56 in return. So that might go way farther. And my understanding from surveys is that there's a bipartisan support for that type of reinvestment, and the majority of Republicans support it. I also wanted to say there's 6 days left to submit your public comment to the DEA about rescheduling. I'm part of a coalition, decriminalizemarijuana.com, where we have a tool. And there was also a great panel by my colleague, Kat Packer at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center to talk about rescheduling. So you can watch that to prepare your comments as well.
Thank you so much. Great plug. Everybody's feel free to plug. Tom, I don't know if you've got the future issue 5 in the works, but you can feel free to plug and or just tell us what we should be working
on. This is going to sound like a little bit of brown nosing, but honestly, just keep doing from the DEPC standpoint, keep doing the things that you guys are doing. I mean, I'll echo what Shaleen said earlier. I view in my practice, I view the PC as, one of the most credible sources of information about this industry, about the myriad of policy issues that are important to the industry and important to people here in Ohio and throughout the country. And you guys are an incredible resource on any number of topics, both the criminal justice reform, but also the marijuana policy piece of this. So just really thankful, Professor Berman, for your work, and Yana and Holly and your team of law students and everything that you guys are doing to give real trustworthy, actionable data and insights to help guide a lot of these really tricky and important policy conversations.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to be self-serving and allow that to be the last word unless Megan wants to jump in with something else. But I am incredibly grateful to all of you, not just the whole DEPC team to help get this platform up and running so effectively, but for all the great insights, Shaleen, Megan, and Tom, you've shared today. I am certain this conversation doesn't end right now, and it's going to continue. And I'm looking forward to being able to call on you to continue to help inform us and the community at large on where we are and where we're headed here in Ohio and nationwide on these important topics. So thank you so much. Appreciate it. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully for the rescheduling event.